Test, test. Hey, so it says my microphone's on, so oh, perfect. Thanks, man. See ya. Good evening, everyone. I see it's 6 o'clock on the East Coast here. I see people are still sort of filing in, so let's just give it a couple more minutes and we'll get started momentarily. Thanks for your patience. Alrighty, well, it's 6:02. So just for the sake of time, let's just get things going. So good evening again, everyone. My name is Michael Wells. I'm a medical affairs MSL fellow in the Rare Diseases Business Unit for the Sanofi Genzyme MCPHS Fellowship. And today, probably for the next 15 minutes or so, we're gonna go do a very high-level overview of what medical affairs is, the certain components of medical affairs or sub-functions, as I'll label them, and then how some of those functionalities translate into one particular area of focus, which is very prominent within medical affairs. Medical affairs has, as we'll see, a very large role in this type of activity, and that's going to be congresses. And then after that, we'll have another 15 minutes or so for question and answers. So I do have some questions that were sent in from y'all previously with the surveys that you filled out, but there is a message board. So if you do have questions that come up during the duration of this presentation, I'll try to get to as many as I possibly can. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. So as with any presentation, this one has objectives. And so these, again, are pretty straightforward. So the first objective being to describe the role of medical affairs and its various sub-functions within the broader pharmaceutical industry. And these sub-functions that I'm going to be referring to are, again, not a comprehensive list per se. Each company is organized in a different manner, but they do give a nice overview about the discrete functionalities that may exist within a medical affairs unit, within a functional area within a specific company. And so the other objective is to identify, and this is probably very important for y'all who are either in the process of going through rotations and maybe even rotating out of a pharmaceutical company, but maybe those who are just trying to get to learn a little bit more about industry, is seeing potential areas where PharmD trained individuals can contribute to a medical affairs team. And so I would say the vast majority of the sub-functionalities that we're going to review today are areas where a PharmD can play a critical role, except for maybe one or two, but I'll definitely be able to point that out. But I think the key take home for this entire presentation will be that PharmD trained individuals can play very critical roles throughout medical affairs in the vast majority of their sub-functionalities. All right, so what is medical affairs? So the traditional pharma model includes two main pillars. The first being the R&D, or the research and development organization, which of course is in charge of developing or creating new products or small molecules, biologics. And then the other pillar being the commercial organization, which is in charge of marketing and selling those products. So there is an additional sort of third branch that is supposed to help sort of bridge those two together, and that's where medical affairs comes in. So medical affairs originally emerged as a reaction to increasing pressures from regulators to separate medical and commercial functions. So companies were experiencing increasing internal demands to focus the role of development on generating and developing new products rather than on managing after FDA approval. So they really wanted the R&D pillar that we just discussed to be more focused on developing the products, and they needed a separate functionality to focus on, okay, once these products are developed, what are the processes that we need to put in place in order to get them out into the market, and to make sure that from a scientific standpoint that key internal and external stakeholders have all the information that they need. So the past 25 years or so, continued regulatory pressure has shifted a number of commercial activities to people with medical expertise, and most often these people fall within the medical affairs groups. So this diagram sort of goes over or outlines the different sub-functionalities that we're going to go over. The one thing I do, maybe you're kind of curious, okay, why is there one that's separate from all the others? And that's being the MSL, or medical science liaison role. And the reason that is that the other sub-functionalities are typically based within the office, whereas an MSL role is external, or it's a field-based position. So their job, their main responsibility is to be out in the field, interfacing and interacting with external stakeholders. That said, MSLs absolutely have internal stakeholders for sure, and we'll sort of touch on a little bit of that. So these terms in general are somewhat ubiquitous within the pharmaceutical industry, but different companies can, like I said before, can have different organizational structures. So for example, at Sanofi Genzyme, medical communications and publications fall under the broader umbrella of scientific communications, or you may hear it called SciComm. So just to provide some clarification on some of these, so pubs being publications, MedCom being medical communications, MedInfo being medical information, MSL being medical science liaison, Med director, medical director, Med ops being medical operations, Med training being medical training, and then competitive intelligence. And so again, we'll sort of go through what each of these sub-functionalities are and the roles that they play. So who are these sort of stakeholders that I mentioned before if you are working within medical affairs? So the first one to draw your attention to is on the sort of middle right or top right is the physicians, nurses, et cetera. And so this is particularly important for the medical science liaison because, again, they being a field role, their job is to interface with these key opinion leaders or KOLs. You might also hear them as KTLs or key thought leaders. And that includes not just physicians, but it's other healthcare providers such as nurses and pharmacists, nurse practitioners, so pretty broad scope. And then that also includes health insurance entities. So that's where you're sort of getting into maybe interacting with your market access team as well. But importantly, there are definitely internal stakeholders, like I said before. So your clinical development team, and this is particularly important for your MSL team when you think about clinical trial recruitment. So the commercial colleagues, of course, you'll hear that commercial and medical are supposed to be separate, and that's absolutely true. But there's definitely a need to collaborate with the commercial team to ensure that messaging is consistent to external stakeholders. Regulatory, legal, and compliance. So there are a lot of laws surrounding interactions, certain interactions that commercial teams and medical teams can partake in. And so understanding and roping in these three teams to ensure that you fall within those boundaries is critical. And then again, I mentioned before the market access team. So when thinking about going to a payer and trying to get a drug on formulary, that's definitely a key collaboration. Okay, so what are some goals? What are the overall goals of medical affairs? And this touches on not just the medical science liaison role or the external stakeholders, but definitely these goals overall are sort of surrounding any position within medical affairs. So the first one being external relationships. Again, a high focus on the medical science liaison role because it's highly focused in field-based work. But again, that the messaging surrounding external interactions and involvement is definitely a key priority across all medical affairs. So the second one being a scientific/medical expert. Again, this role within medical affairs is very much science driven. So the goal of medical affairs is not to push products per se. That sort of falls within the role of commercial. So the goal of medical is to train and educate colleagues internally and then to provide guidance and insight to external stakeholders. So again, not trying to guide or influence therapy choices, but making sure that from a scientific standpoint, all the information that's pertinent to the products has been disseminated appropriately. And then finally, addressing unmet medical need, and that again sort of falls under being the scientific and medical expert as well, in the sense that it's identifying where there are gaps in knowledge and making sure that you have the proper tools to try to fill those gaps. So to briefly just run through what each of these sub-functions are. So publications, again, a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory, so not really a need to go through exactly what everything is on the slide, but just knowing the high-level detail, the high-level messaging for each of these is the key takeaway that I want you all to get from this. And so publications, as it may imply, is definitely focused on the creation and the generation of any type of scientific information that's disseminated to the broader medical community. So whether that be publications in peer-reviewed journals, whether that be creation of posters that get presented at scientific congresses or conferences, it's sort of the job in publications to generate these deliverables. And so one of the key things behind this is creation of a very thorough plan. So it's pretty impressive to see sometimes these plans go out years and years in advance to make sure that the timing of data release or data publication sort of falls in line with the product outline. So the next being medical communications. So if you think about publications being responsible for the generation of external scientific communication, MedCom is sort of responsible for the generation of internal scientific material. So from top to bottom, MedCom sort of ensures that internal personnel are aware of the current messaging of the company, whether that be through training materials, competitive intelligence reports, Congress activities, literature reviews, and other important pieces of communication. So this is definitely a highly collaborative role with all the other sub-functions within medical affairs. And it's, again, you definitely want to make sure that all the internal personnel are updated with the most relevant, scientific information for their respective therapeutic and disease state areas. So MedInfo is responsible for the creation and the formatting of various documents. You may hear them called SRLs, or standard response letters. And so they utilize these tools when they get an inquiry from an external stakeholder. So if, for example, if an MSL is interacting with a KOL and they don't really, maybe they're asked a question, they don't know the answer off the top of their head, or warrants further a deeper dive into the medical literature, this is where they can sort of punt that to the MedInfo team, and MedInfo is responsible for addressing these inquiries. And so, they're based in the office, but they can also play a role at congresses where, similar to the MSLs, they can sort of manage the medical booth and respond to inquiries in real time. So MSL, so we've sort of talked about the MSL role already. I think we've sort of, each of these bullet points have already been addressed. But I think importantly, if you're sort of unsure about what the role actually is, I think the important way that I typically think about it is just by breaking down each of the components of the title itself, and that medical is not only, so if you look at the first word, so medical being not only to indicate the functional area, but also it represents the key stakeholders. So those being involved with making medical decisions, or speaking more broadly, the medical community. And then science being that is the nature of the discussions and the knowledge base that the MSL is responsible for and is expected to know. And then liaison being that they are the intermediary between these KOLs or healthcare providers and the company itself to bring these medical or clinical insights back to the company from the field. So medical director, so this is probably the one position that isn't very commonly held by a PharmD. So typically this is someone who's trained as an MD. However, it's not unknown for a medical director to be someone that is not a medically trained person. So the medical director is traditionally responsible for the overall direction of the company, of course, from the medical affairs perspective, including such things as Congress attendance, ad boards, and maybe clinical trial design. So they do interface with physicians, not as frequently as maybe an MSL would. They can also give certain presentations at congresses and be heavily involved at certain meetings with KOLs. And again, the ad boards probably being one of the most prominent ones. Overall, the medical director is the head of a specific therapeutic area or disease state and determines or oversees the execution of the majority of the medical affairs plans or activities. So medical operations or MedOps is responsible for the logistical components of medical affairs. So MedOps, at least from a Sanofi Genzyme perspective, again, keeping in mind that these can vary across organizations, MedOps is primarily responsible for the management of medical materials and Congress planning, or again, as the name implies, the general operations of medical affairs. So also can be heavily involved with MSL teams, thinking from the perspective of KPIs or key performance indices, and making sure that the MSLs have all the tools that they need to be effective in the field, whether that be certain materials or their applications that they're dealing with are up to date and up to speed. So medical training is pretty self-explanatory. So they're responsible for the development of content that the medical team uses to be trained, whether that be on disease state or product specific. And they're responsible not only for their new hires or personnel that get hired within medical affairs, but also responsible for the continuing education of current employees. Because as we all know, the medical landscape is constantly changing, and if it's pretty challenging to stay up to date with all the new information that's coming out, regardless of what disease state or products that you cover. So it's important to make sure your medical training team keeps everyone up to speed. And last but not least, competitive intelligence. Again, pretty self-explanatory. Overall objective is to keep tabs on competitors within the field, their research that's being presented at congresses, if they have any press releases, giving regular competitive intelligence updates. So for example, Sanofi Genzyme, we have in our competitive intelligence group, there's a daily update that's given across all rare diseases. So it helps to keep people informed, not only of our diseases that we're we're investigating or that we have product in, but also the broader rare disease landscape. So the last thing I want to touch on very briefly is medical affairs and their involvement in certain congresses. So congresses, so I guess to dive into a little bit deeper, so what is a congress exactly? So it's a meeting that individuals can attend that they maybe belong to a single profession. It usually lasts several days and can occur on an annual basis or maybe a biannual basis. You may have also heard the term conference. So a conference, though, is a little bit different in that a conference may not carry a special connotation as far as its frequency, and it's usually on a smaller scale and more select. So congresses, once y'all get out into the field, you'll definitely see the congresses tend to be maybe more internationally recognized, tend to be a little bit larger, gather more specialists within a particular field at one location, and can be a little bit longer in duration. So some of the activities that can occur, so you have symposia. So it can be sponsored by a specific company. Symposia can occur by hiring, maybe a pharmaceutical company hires a KOL or someone who's influential in the field to talk about a specific therapeutic area, or maybe it could be 100% science driven. These symposia can be driven by commercial or medical, but from a medical perspective, we kind of have to be hands off as far as who gets selected, because of course you don't want to appear as though you're biasing towards certain KOLs with the potential for influencing. As the bottom of the slide indicates, some of these activities can provide continuing medical education or CME, which as pharmacists, we once we get licensed, we're required to have CE, depending on the state, over a certain number of CE credits over a certain period of time. And so analogously for physicians, they require CME. So poster sessions, again, pretty self-explanatory. This is another avenue where scientific information and research can be disseminated in the form of a poster. And then plenary sessions, which are available to all attendees, and they can be either focused on a particular research topic with multiple presenters, or they can be a panel of experts that sort of maybe go through a sort of case-based scenario. So for those of you who have been to mid-year, I'm sure you're pretty familiar with this. So there is sort of the booth area, the booth space, where you can have pharmaceutical companies or medical device companies have a quote-unquote booth. And, a lot of people go for the free stuff there. But, from the medical perspective, we have a presence there to sort of answer any questions that may come up in the field. It allows us to interact on a face-to-face basis with anyone who may have questions. And so it's important to note that the medical and commercial booth needs to be completely separate from each other. And the types of things that can be discussed is not any different than it would be as if you were out in the field. So for example, if an off-label question is asked at the commercial booth, the respondent needs to direct the questioner to the medical booth to avoid being non-compliant. So the medical booth itself has a lot of different tools that can focus on medical education about the disease or the medication itself. The medical team can create different types of materials for reactive versus proactive use, and that just speaks to whether or not that material can be used if a question is asked, or that can be used if a question is not asked. And the medical booth is typically staffed by members such as the MSLs or people for medical information. So I'm not going to go through all this, but this, again, I wanted to make sure that people were aware of, we went through all these different sub-functions of medical affairs, and so these are just the different ways that the different sub-functions are involved within congresses. So again, a lot of moving parts, a huge presence of medical affairs. It's really important for all these different areas to be involved because they each have a very specific function, which is critical to the success of the medical affairs team. So with that, I appreciate your attention. And so just to move on, thank you for the people who told me they can hear me. I mean, that would have been super disappointing if I just checked that now and you didn't hear me. But thank you for buzzing in. So I don't see any questions on the board at this point. So some of the questions I received prior to this was, so what can I do while in school to allow myself the best opportunity to acquire a career in this field upon graduation? So that's obviously that's the golden question, right? So how do I get involved in industry? So in general, industry is, as you may have heard, a very hard field, a very challenging field to break into. Definitely a fellowship is a very good route to pursue if you're interested in getting involved within industry broadly. Then, of course, if you want to get involved in medical affairs, obviously the training you get during your fellowship, if you do a medical affairs fellowship, will prepare you to transition into a full-time role. However, that does not mean that if you do a medical affairs fellowship, you can't transition to a different functional area and vice versa. So I think the important part is making sure that you expose yourself to a broad range of experiences while you are a fellow, if you decide to pursue fellowship. But also know that another sort of route to get into medical affairs is medical information. So that's a route. It's definitely, I don't want to say easy, but that's more of the traditional immediately graduating from pharmacy school and getting into industry. That's sort of the route that a lot of people take as far as an entry-level industry position. Okay, so starting to get some questions rolling in here. So how much travel, national and international, is involved with your position? Good question. So obviously the roles vary, within medical affairs broadly, that varies a lot. So my role being focused in the medical science liaison position, and that being a field-based role, I have a lot of travel. It definitely fluctuates. So I'm not on the road constantly, and I'm not in the office constantly. I will say primarily I am in the office, but a lot of my experiences are supplemented by field work. So whether that be traveling to congresses, or whether that be going to internal events but that are held offsite, or whether that be going to KOL visits or different institutions to speak with KOLs, it definitely varies. I would say on average, I probably travel at least once every 2 weeks. Again, with depending on the season, being a little more busy during some times than others. And then the next question was, how often do you attend Congress meetings? So I would say on average, probably about 3 to 4 times a year. So of course that depends. Fellows usually get a lot more opportunities to travel versus say like a full-time MSL. As far as Congress attendance, so they typically do 2 to 3 a year, whereas the fellows have a little more flexibility and do 3 or 4, sometimes even more. But I guess to get back to the other part of that, being the question being international travel. So my position is based in North America, so I'm North American Medical Affairs, so I don't really do any international travel, but there's global medical affairs, and they do a lot of international travel. So for example, one of my co-fellows at Sanofi Genzyme, who's in global medical affairs for medical communications, she is actually in Europe right now. Other fellows have gone to Japan. So there's a lot of opportunity to travel internationally if you do a global, if you're doing medical affairs and you're doing a global fellowship. So next question, in your fellowship, are you rotating between the various medical affairs roles, or do you focus primarily on the MSL role? So that's a great question. So the name of the fellowship is Medical Affairs / MSL. However, my fellowship is 100% focused on the MSL role. That said, there are opportunities to work cross-functionally. So, and that will pretty much be the case for any fellowship, is at least within medical affairs. If you want exposure to something, there should be opportunities for you to get that sort of exposure. That's a key question to ask during fellowships, is what is the structure of the program itself? So if it says medical affairs, does that mean that you're focusing within SciComm or within publications, but there are opportunities to rotate that the fellow has to establish, or are there preset rotations, a preset rotation schedule that's already established? So that's a really good question, something that should definitely be asked during fellowship interviews, because again, it varies from program to program. Okay, so next question, what should you look for in fellowship programs when deciding between different ones? Wow, that might be a whole different webinar. So I guess very briefly, the things I considered were, so what was the therapeutic area? So is this something that I think is applicable, or is in a quote unquote hot area within the pharmaceutical industry? So I would say probably rare diseases and oncology, immunology. Those are probably, I would say, some of the hottest areas, and potentially maybe the best opportunities to get a position after fellowship. That said, it's definitely not a hard and fast rule. So I think it's making sure, if you're in a therapeutic area, I mean, they're all challenging, but if you could do something a little bit, if you focus on something maybe a little more niche, that obviously allows you to focus on positions that have that sort of same niche, but it also shows that you're able to, because it's such a focused area, you're able to sort of spread that across to different therapeutic areas. Other things to consider were the duration of the program, whether there's an academic affiliation, where the program's located itself. So definitely a lot of different components from the academic side of things. So for example, like UNC's fellowship program requires you to do, it's a 2-year program like MCPHS, but they require you to do 1 year at the university. So is that something that you want to be exposed to or not? So just getting a very good understanding of what the fellowship is comprised of and what there are the expectations prior to committing to a program, and asking those questions up front. Doing your research online. There's a lot of information available online. So, and reaching out to fellows, like me, I'm always more than happy to answer any questions that any of y'all may have when it comes to fellowship. Making those connections, networking, of course, is obviously a really big thing. So next question, did you know that you were interested in medical affairs prior to starting your fellowship? Absolutely not. So I had, so I guess prior to starting my fellowship, yes, actually sorry, let me take a step back. I didn't know I was interested in industry until my 4th year of pharmacy school. So I was 100% set on doing a residency. And then I did a rotation at a pharmaceutical company and absolutely loved it. So I didn't even decide to pursue fellowship until probably 3 months into my 4th year of pharmacy school. So after a couple of APB rotations. So if you're just starting rotations, you're not sure, like, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. You still have some time to figure it out. I would recommend doing your research. But I guess getting more back to the question that was asked, I did know I was interested in medical affairs because I did 2 rotations, which were both focused within medical affairs. And so I knew that it really allowed one to utilize the skills that are learned as a PharmD trained individual, in the sense that you're still responsible for therapeutic and disease state knowledge. And also, I enjoy the interaction component of it and the communication aspect of it. So I knew I wanted to do medical affairs. I wasn't 100% sure on the MSL role, but through this process, it sort of allows you to, it's allowed me to get some really key exposure to the medical science liaison role, and it's sort of affirmed that that's something I want to pursue after fellowship. So, but again, if you commit to something that's medical affairs or MSL focused, it doesn't necessarily mean you need, I don't need to absolutely be an MSL after this. And again, if you do, like, say, a MedCom rotation, doesn't mean you need to be an MSL. I mean, at Sanofi Genzyme, we just had 2 of our commercial fellows who graduated become MSL. So even across completely different functional areas, they were able to get a pretty sought after position. So again, I think it's important to consider these things. And if you know you want to do medical affairs, yes, it's probably a good idea to pursue a medical affairs fellowship. But just know that if you do pick one functional area and you realize that maybe that wasn't the ideal one for you, just ask it exposure to different things while you're a fellow, and then try to leverage those experiences and translating them to how those experiences would be beneficial for you in a different role. Okay, I talk about a project I'm working on in your role in as a fellow. So yeah, so a lot of the MSLs are highly involved in what we call a disease expert team. So Sanofi Genzyme has 4 approved treatments for 4 different rare diseases. And so the MSLs are sort of segregated into different expert teams that address one of those diseases. And so one of my current internal projects that I'm working on is development of training material for incoming MSLs. So that's sort of revamping the current process. So my fellowship's nice in that I go through the same onboarding process that full-time MSLs do. So I get certified similar to them. And so I've already been exposed to the training. So I sort of know where the gaps in knowledge maybe lie, or maybe where certain components can be optimized. So I'm responsible now, or I'm helping to sort of revamp that material. But externally, and probably more importantly to the MSL role itself, is sort of managing a couple institutions within the Boston area, interacting directly with the KOL, so getting sort of that real MSL experience and learning sort of what are the rules and regulations behind being an MSL and how to carry out these interactions and maintain those relationships. Okay. So will my email be? Yes, I think it is. My email is provided at the end of this. I'm more than happy. Yeah, I think it is. I'm pretty sure it is. If not, you can I'll figure out a way to get you all my email if it's not. But yeah, again, like I said before, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions with regards to fellowship or my experience in particular, or rare diseases, or Sanofi Genzyme, I mean, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that y'all may have. So next question was, you said earlier that MSLs also interact with health insurance. Can you explain a little bit more about that? Thank you. You're welcome. So again, the interactions with insurance companies or managed care organizations is really the MSL's role in that sense is to provide content that cannot necessarily be addressed by the team that's assigned to manage those payers. And so there are a couple ways that this can be done, or a couple of types, at least in Sanofi Genzyme's role or position. It's more talking about, so for example, we can talk about pipeline stuff. So we can talk about off-label and outcomes data and pipeline. And so that's sort of what's important to a payer, right? Is what are you can only gain so much from the label. And so from the packaging insert. So what can happen is we can have the medical managed care team or the market access team reach out to the medical science liaison and say, I have a payer who wants more information regarding clinical outcomes surrounding our product. So then the MSL goes to that payer and gives a presentation around the data, around the data of that particular product. So they still are an external stakeholder. It's just the types of conversations that you have may be a little bit different than if it was a physician or another type of healthcare provider. Hope that answers your question, because I sort of said you're welcome a little prematurely. How would you describe the culture at Sanofi Genzyme? Sanofi Genzyme it's a lot of fun. Pharma in general is, I have never met anyone who is in the middle of fellowship or has completed fellowship that said they did not have fun during their fellowship. Sanofi Genzyme is sort of definitely absolutely falls in that same realm. It's a very, very exciting space. My role in particular is very exciting because rare diseases is a field with a lot of information coming out. But Sanofi Genzyme in general is sort of the specialty care unit of Sanofi itself. And so there are a lot of really interesting products that are in development. There's a lot of interesting research. There's a lot of competition that's coming to the market. So competition, is definitely a good thing. It keeps people on their game per se. And I would say that Sanofi Genzyme, sort of, for those of you who don't know the history of it, was Genzyme prior to being acquired by Sanofi back in 2011. And so it sort of went through this transition phase of being more of the biotech realm to being now big pharma. I mean, Sanofi is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And so, but that culture of there's a saying that they have at Sanofi, which is to stay patient-focused and science-driven. And so I think, especially working in rare diseases, I mean, the opportunities you get to see, the impact that you make on these patients' lives. I mean, 3 of the 4 products that Sanofi Genzyme has in the rare diseases portfolio is the only treatment available in the United States. I mean, so we clearly play a very big role. And so being able to be exposed to that sort of area, that therapeutic area, is a very unique experience. But again, I think that the key take home is very much so patient focused and science driven. So there aren't any more questions on the message board. I'm happy to answer in the maybe next 10 minutes or so the remaining questions, so if y'all have any more questions, please feel free to write message on the board. But I definitely want to answer the rest of the questions that y'all submitted prior to this. Possibility of getting fellowship as an international student. I apologize. I can't really speak to that, to be completely honest with you. I think the key thing would be the accreditation from the pharmacy school. But again, that's something that would definitely need to be addressed by a program director at definitely, more of a higher level. Okay. Biggest piece of advice for mid-year. Oh, wow. That's a really good question. Biggest piece of advice. So biggest piece of advice would be stay organized. So have your schedule, know your schedule, know where you need to be at the right time. I mean, depending on how many, companies or programs you apply to, of course, that's going to dictate how much, how you can coordinate your schedule. But it's so key to make sure that everything is aligned. and just being able and so I guess I'll give two things. So it's kind of hard to pick one. But yeah, definitely making sure you know your schedule, know where you need to be at the right time. And the other thing too is knowing yourself. I mean, being able, to do your homework and know the questions that are going to be asked, but knowing your CV, knowing, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses, knowing what are you most proud of, what's the most impressive thing, both personally and professionally, that you've accomplished during your time in pharmacy school and maybe even leading up to pharmacy school. Being able to speak to why you want to do a certain program, or why maybe you can speak to why you don't want to do other kinds of programs, but just knowing yourself and why you're there, I think is important. And then again, definitely making sure you're organized. Do you play a role in the clinical trial aspect of drug research and development? So the really medical affairs doesn't typically get too involved until around, so different components get involved earlier, right? So if you're talking about, publications, they obviously get involved as early as phase 1 or as early as preclinical. But as far as medical science liaisons, you're typically not super involved until about the phase 3 and onward. Because, and again, with MSLs in particular, that's where you start thinking about trial recruitment. Me personally, I haven't really had much exposure to clinical trial recruitment. But again, making sure you can speak to what the current pipeline products are, and what are the trials your company is currently coordinating. I think that's probably the key component from the MSL and medical affairs perspective. Okay, so Alvin did post my email on there. I hope y'all can see it. If you can, please let me know. Okay, do you think doing an APB rotation with the FDA would prepare me for the medical affairs route? So I will say that I think there are a lot of, so it's not necessarily, you need to do a rotation. I think it's super helpful, obviously, if you do a rotation within medical affairs or within industry. But I think it's more so important, what are the skills that you gain during that time on rotation? Like, what were you able to contribute to your team? What deliverables were you able to generate? I think that's key. I will say, it's definitely, there's definitely a trend upward in the number of people who have had internships and done industry-specific rotations, who are getting fellowships. But I know, like, for example, one of our MSL fellows who just graduated, she did a rotation at the FDA and didn't actually have an industry internship or rotation. So again, it's not a prerequisite per se to do, in order to get a fellowship. But I would say, it's definitely a good experience to have for sure. But again, I think it's more so, what are the types of projects you were involved with? What are the skills you developed, and how do you leverage those and say, oh, well, these experiences translated into X, Y, and Z, which is a key skill to gain or a key skill to have in order to be successful in medical affairs. I think it just depends on how you frame it, but it's definitely not, it definitely can't hurt. I mean, to say the least. Okay. How many companies would you advise students to apply to at mid-year? I've heard programs through Rutgers have several rounds of interviews. It's a similar structure with MCPHS. Okay, so the first question, I would say, I think a safe number is anywhere between 10 to 15. And so the reason I say 10 to 15 is that anything, it's definitely a very competitive process. So you don't want to sell yourself short, but at the same time, you don't want to overwhelm yourself and apply to, 15 plus, 20 plus programs, because then scheduling becomes an issue. And you may be depriving yourself of a good experience at a company you would actually like for maybe one that you're not as good of a fit as, just because you're just applying to so many different companies. So you're right. So there are definitely different programs do it differently as far as the number of rounds of interviews. So I know one program at Rutgers I interviewed with, they had 3 different rounds of interviews. Whereas, Eli Lilly, they interview you once and you either get a mid-year reception or not. So it totally depends on the company. Again, it's a key component to this is scheduling. So definitely make sure you keep your schedule or your calendar on the PPS, on your PPS profile as up to date as possible, because companies will, without even asking you, after you apply, some companies will just put an appointment to interview directly on your calendar. Without trying to coordinate ahead of time. So make sure that's as up to date as possible. And then I guess the last question, is it similar structure with MCPHS? Um, MCPHS, I think actually the MSL program, I think only had one interview, if I remember correctly, as well. But again, that may vary. Again, it can even vary within the same company, but just a different program. So you sort of just have to be on your toes. And again, that comes back to the organization and the scheduling component of things, just making sure you're aware of what things are looking like, so you don't double book yourself. You don't sort of run yourself out, if you will. What has been the most challenging aspect of your MSL fellowship? Yeah, that's a really good question. So most challenging aspect, let's see, so I would say the most challenging aspect is learning, because I'm in the MSL role, is learning the compliance and regulatory components of things. So again, that's a very, very large component of the role. I mean, obviously you need to have the scientific and therapeutic and disease state knowledge and understanding, and hence why PharmDs are highly sought after. But it's definitely a huge component of it is knowing your resources and being able to understand what can I and what can I not say. That's probably, so that's focused on, right, the fellowships, specific, the role itself. But I guess looking more broadly at the fellowship component of things, is just it's time management, knowing where to allocate your time and energy towards certain projects, being able to prioritize. I know that sounds so cliche, but it's really true, because I mean, there are a lot of opportunities to get involved. There are a lot of things to learn. So just being able to know what are the things that are our highest priority at this point and contribute most to the team. All right. How much autonomy are you given in your role in regards to building relationships / educating KOLs? Are you attending these meetings on your own? Excellent question. So at this point in time, so I'm just starting my second year, and so at this point in time, the answer is no. So as far as meeting with KOLs on my own, no, I'm not at that point. But I do have a lot of autonomy as far as initiating interaction. So or initiating, conversations via email or via telephone. But as far as any types of these interactions, the MSL, who is sort of like my mentor, is roped into all of this. So she's aware of all the activities that are going on, any type of phone interaction or face-to-face interaction. She's there just to sort of facilitate and just to make sure I stay in my lane, if you will. But again, it's great. And I think if you're interested in the MSL role, a key question to ask during interviews is, what, if this being an MSL fellowship, like, what is the MSL component of the fellowship? Do I get assigned a territory or institutions? When does that happen? For what period of time? How integrated am I into the team? So I think those are all key questions to ask if you're doing an MSL focused fellowship, because those in general, if those aren't in place, those are very challenging to establish, because you have to have sort of a lot of people involved and getting a lot of buy-in from the team. So definitely important questions to ask. All right. Well, I think we're at the cutoff point now. If you have any more questions, or maybe if there was a question that you asked in the pre-survey that I didn't address at this point, again, my email I've been posted. So it's michael.wells@sanofi.com. So if you have any questions, again, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to answer any questions y'all may have. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks for listening in, and good luck in whatever type of future endeavor you get involved in. Take care.